20 of the Gospel of Mark, looking at chapter 3, verses 33 through 41, 9 verses there. And we're calling this Calming the Storm. The title may tell you that you've probably heard 50 sermons on this particular section of Mark before. So that's all right. We're going to keep on because we've got several very well-known popular narrative sessions in this part of the chapter, the book of Mark. But before we begin, I need to tell you a little something maybe that you haven't been privy to. We've been in Mark now the better part of 3 months, and you may notice now and this is a return for me. I've been out of the game for about 6 weeks, something like that. So you may note a bit of difference, particularly in the way I pronounce words or the words that I actually use, or the speed at which I speak. Now, why did that happen? Well, it was a series of incidents that most of you probably recall that back on the 21st of January, I broke my ankle when sliding on some ice. I had a number of screws installed and a plate installed in order to stabilize the ankle. The ankle actually was never part of the issue. So what happened that did cause the issue? Well, there was a fairly strong string of unwelcome events, at least unwelcome from my point of view. And I'll give you a very brief look at a few of those so you have an idea what I'm cautioning you about what you may think about any difference you now perceive in our study. There's no intent for the study to be any different, but it may look and sound somewhat different. In March, mid-March, for example, I was told that there was infection in the ankle and that it would require another surgery, a second surgery, to remove all the hardware. The day before that removal was to take place, a person trying to help me wheeled me down a walkway that had a couple steps in it, slipped on one of the steps and fell, jerked me backward, and somehow I banged my head fairly hardly, and it has to be quite hardly for this to happen. I ended up with the first concussion of my life. The emergency room took care of that, and so on the next days, the screws and the plate were removed. Well, unfortunately, that didn't end it. 4 days later, 4 days after the surgery, which would mean 5 days after receiving the concussion, we had to check my blood coagulation level. That happens to old people too, and found that the time it would take for my blood to coagulate or clot, whatever term you want to use, was more than 5 times normal. Now, you just saw the problem that I'm talking about. 5 times normal became 5 tormal. Those things are going to happen, they tell me, for up to about 6 months. But after getting and finding out what my coagulation time was, I was wheeling myself up a ramp into our house, at least so I intended, but flipped myself backward over and hit the back of my head, or actually it was the side of my head, the left side, which many of you know is the speech control side of your brain, by flipping my wheelchair over. My fault. Not sure what I did to cause it, but it was my fault, and so I suffered a second concussion, but this time under more dangerous conditions, because there was, very slow coagulation. So blood was going to flow in the brain, could very likely cause pressure, of course, even worse. So the surgery at the emergency room, or at the hospital at least, drilled a hole in the side of my head and placed a tube in that hole that would allow blood to escape. So at least I'm still here. One of the 3 rehab efforts following a brain injury that involves speech in particular is speech rehabilitation. These are professionals trained to bring people to the spot where their brain begins to function more normally than it will after a very dangerous issue. During one such session, my speech became so jumbled and ununderstandable, it scared a 20-year-old professional who literally ran to find a medical doctor. I was at a rehabilitation hospital at the time, and within less than 45 minutes, my temperature had gone from normal 97 something to 103. So they sent me back to a hospital setting again. They learned that I had a second infection, probably not even related to the ankle, but it was never located. However, it was eliminated so far as they understand. Well, now I'm back home, but I'm back home, but I'm still under the same therapies that I was at the hospital. It's a little more convenient now, a little better. I am making good progress. Surprisingly, I was able to create the lesson that we will look at very soon. Remember, as after at least 6 weeks of doing nothing in terms of study and lesson creation, I'm back doing it, and I've returned to a position where that is doable. Doesn't mean you won't see differences. Doesn't mean there won't be differences. But I am able to do it and intend to do precisely that. The ankle, that started the whole thing, but outside of at least one of the infections, the ankle really has not been a problem. It's brought me no pain, no serious limit, at least with respect to the Gospel of Mark. It has not. Praise the Lord. I have no particular excuse for being able to return this quickly. It is not of my doing. Well, in the next 9 verses of Mark that we're going to look at, beginning in 9:33, what we have, excuse me, is what I would say is technically an unexplained event, an event unlike any previously experienced by the 12. And I think most of the time when people talk about this event, they don't mention that these guys, when we get to the last verses, we find that what Christ did scared them worse than the storm did. Why would that be true? Well, it's because it's something they had never seen or experienced before, I am sure. We'll get there shortly. It's going to be a fairly short lesson. Jesus had just spent, I'm trying to go back and bring me back with where you guys have just been. Jesus had just spent a long day of teaching in parables, and it apparently was a quite tiring day. That itself might have been sufficient reason for the instruction in these first of our verses. I'm going to read verses 33 through 35. And with many such parables he, Jesus, of course, was speaking the word to them as they were able to hear it. Verse 34, and he did not speak to them without a parable, but he was explaining everything privately to his own disciples. Remember, in Mark, his own disciples refers to the 12. Verse 35, and on that day, when evening had come, so this is an entire day of teaching, he said to them, to the 12, let's go over to the other side. Notice he doesn't say why. He gives no purpose. He just says, let's go. The course that they are going to taking, of course, would be toward the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And it would most likely be quite a bit south toward the Dead Sea as well. So you can see them going southeast across the lake, perhaps. Or did they? I don't know. They could have gone east and then south, or south and the east zigzag. Who knows? So think of this as we look at the 9 verses. If Jesus said, let's go over to the other sea, what should you know? Wouldn't you know that he would be successful in taking you to the other side of the sea? Should there be anything that you think could stop Jesus from doing exactly what he said he wanted to do? Well, again, it's likely that all of you have heard numerous sermons on the rest of chapter 3 and chapter 4, and you know that the Sea of Galilee has a strong reputation for turning violent and dangerous at any moment. Now, typically, that doesn't happen at night. However, this evidently was not a typical evening. So, they took off across the lake. What's going to happen next? Verse 36 of Mark 4. Did I say Mark 4? Yes, Mark 4. I've been saying 3 earlier, but this is 4. And leaving the multitude, they took him, Jesus, along with them, just as he was. So there was no particular moment of refreshing. There was no evidently a moment to go eat. There was evidently no moment to go get dressed differently. They took him exactly as he was when he finished teaching. And verse 36 continues, in the boat, and other boats were with them. That's something that we seldom ever hear in sermons either, that this was a small flotilla, evidently, not just one boat that we're going to have in the middle of whatever comes up. But note several factors. There were no great elaborate preparations. Jesus went just as he was after the day of teaching. No time of rushing and so forth, as we've said. Their boat was not the only one. There was apparently a small flotilla. But at some point, everything broke loose. We're not told where the boats are on the lake. Had they just begun? Were they in the middle, a long ways away from land? How far south had they traveled? How far east had they traveled? We know nothing of these details. Verse 37, and there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling with water. So this was not a little wind, a little bit of breeze blowing a few waves. No, these waves were pounding up and over the boat. But where was Jesus? Verse 38, and he himself was in the stern, the back, of course. Most of you probably know that term. What was he doing? He was asleep on the cushion, probably a cushion just big enough for his bed. And they, the 12, awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Of course, he was sound asleep before they woke him. Keep in mind that several of these 12 were experienced professional fishermen. They were men of the lake. They knew what that storm meant. But what does their fear tell us? Think back to what the question I asked just after we read the first verses. What does their fear tell us? I think it tells us that they either still did not truly have solid faith in Jesus, or they did not yet truly understand who Jesus was and what power he had. There's something missing that would build solid faith. They were on the sea because Jesus said, let us go to the other side. So, did they not believe that since Jesus purposed their going across the sea, failure might be a possibility? Check Jesus' action. Verse 39, and being aroused, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, hush, be still. He didn't holler. See, he just said, hush, be still. And what happened? And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. verse 40. And he said to them, the 12, why are you so timid? How is it that you have no faith? So Jesus is accusing them of not having faith in him and becoming afraid every time there is some measure of danger. Now, it's not that the normal person wouldn't get terrified in such a situation, but these were men, and look at their reaction, our last verse, verse 41. And they, the 12, became very much afraid, and said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Why were they even more frightened when they saw what Jesus did? And that hit them, what Jesus was truly capable of doing. Why did they become even more frightened then? Well, let me tell you Don's answer. They had seen Jesus heal the sick. They had seen him exercise power over demons. But they had evidently never seen him exercise control and power over creation, of which he is the primary agent, of course. It was time for them to rethink who this Jesus in truth was. He was certainly more than a healer, more than an exorcist, more than a competent rabbi with more truth than any other rabbi. Well, hang in there, because the level of the excitement, danger, misunderstanding doesn't slow down. Once they get to the other side, they land on land and they get out of the boat, there will be another event, which very likely was Jesus' primary purpose in crossing over the lake, that he wanted to show them who he was relative to creation and the power he had, and he wanted to show them another example and another region, an example of a well-known exorcism. We'll see you next time. Thank you for being here.